political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to political conspiracies. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California. And now, Mae Brussell.
This is Mae Brussell. It's Dialogue Conspiracy number 283, and it's August the 22nd, 977. I'm going to continue this week a part 2 of Son of Sam, an intriguing case. I discussed it last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, aspects of that case, and there's so much material coming in the news media that I want to continue on that subject. The reason I'm talking about Son of Sam in a two-part series, and will be referring to him many, many times in the future, is that he probably, as of this day, is the most perfect example of the CIA experiments of mind control. I have named at various times on this program maybe 30 or 40 other persons that have been under the control of the experimentation of people like Dr. Jolly West at UCLA or Dr. Jose Delgado from Yale University. But there are literally hundreds of institutions across the country that can be involved in this process now, and there are certain centers that can be pinpointed for training people to alter their minds and change their behavior, and one of those places is South Korea. I also said last week on Dialogue Conspiracy that the family of Stacy Moskowitz should sue the police department in New York City and Yonkers because their daughter was unnecessarily murdered, that the police had evidence as early as June that David Berkowitz was Son of Sam and that he had done these murders in New York, and yet the police chose not to arrest him, and it was identical to the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department having evidence that the Manson family was going to do a large massacre and protecting them from the law enforcement arrests or going into the Spahn Ranch to get them before Sharon Tate and the others in her home and Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca were killed. After I was on the program last Monday, the Tuesday newspaper across the country, the Associated Press, announced that Mr. and Mrs. Moskowitz were suing the Yonkers Police Department for $10 million. They claimed that there was negligence in the case of their daughter's death. They charged the police work with negligence as they knew as early as April, had evidence that David Berkowitz was the Son of Sam who's doing the murders. I had pinpointed to June, a month before the last killing, but they have proof as early as April. They said he should have been arrested, that the police had certain leads, which they didn't follow up, and if they had followed them up, their daughter would be alive today. I mentioned that I would be sending this two-part cassette to the family of Stacy Berkowitz. I also am trying to get Stacy Moskowitz. I'm also trying to get the address of the Berkowitz family and send them a copy of these programs and suggest that they have a lawsuit against the federal government for programming their son David, who signed up voluntarily to go to war and was a typist in South Korea until he became a conscientious objector and then was given the kind of LSD with these many chemicals in that altered personalities of some of the most famous or notorious of our court cases today, and he was a typical pattern, and his crime was that he became a conscientious objector and didn't want to continue holding a gun or being in the service. I called him the Son of Sam, literally meaning that he was the son of Uncle Sam, and that his referring to himself as Uncle Sam was because he was in the control of the government and couldn't break that bondage. That was last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, August the 15th. And then the Salt Lake Tribune had an article 3 days later, August 18th, more indictments likely in the Son of Sam murders. And it goes on to quote, an Army friend said that David Berkowitz adopted the name the Son of Sam because he believed that he was a pawn of the United States government, symbolized by Uncle Sam. Terry Peterson, 24, from McFarland, Wisconsin, said in an interview that they were best buddies in Korea. And when David Berkowitz complained about what the Army was doing to him over there, he took a lot of static after he filed those conscientious objector forms. I would just tell him, well, you signed up, and now you're just a Son of Sam, said Peterson. What I meant was that he was a soldier for Uncle Sam, and he was obligated to serve his country. But he took that to mean that he was a pawn in the tool of a big game, and that the establishment was making him play it. I'm certain that's where the name Son of Sam came from. And that is from an Army buddy. They used that reference that when he wanted to get out of the Army and they wouldn't let him, he became their pawn. I'm going to give an example here on KLRB in a few minutes of a man at Fort Ord who was listening to my programs in May of 1972 and wanted to get out of the Army when Richard Nixon was heavily bombing Cambodia. And I'll read you the psychiatric reports at Fort Ord, California. And I saved this person from having psychological tests and being sent to South Carolina, and offered to help him with a court-martial when he claimed that the government was fouling over these people and lying to them and conducting wars overseas like Laos and Cambodia without the American people knowing it. And I was instrumental in stopping his testing with drugs and psychologists of the U.S. Army when he was putting up the same kind of a fuss that David Berkowitz was doing in South Korea. So I know that the government was interjecting with these people that didn't like the war, that were already in the service, and they didn't want them fragging officers. They didn't want them joining the Vietnam veterans against the war. And one of the alternatives was to turn them around psychologically and then send them home as killers and make them go against their first feelings of anti-war and perform killings in America. In my article, The SLA is the CIA, that I wrote in 1974, I talked about what Uncle Sam was doing to people inside the prisons to test them, and also to people who objected to the war, conscientious objectors. But I mentioned that the experimentation and the hypnosis programs had been going on for quite a few years in prisons and mental hospitals for 15 years. I mentioned an inmate from Vacaville Medical Facility who wrote to me through KZAP. He listened to my shows that were playing up at KZAP at the time, and he told me that employed persons at Vacaville were holding down prisoners against their wishes, while two officers by the name of Octine and Rudol, he referred to Mr. Rudol as the Gestapo, were administering double doses of some medication that were for the specific purpose of making distinct changes in their personalities. This was happening in California, and I knew about this in 1974 and wrote about it. And just August the 2nd, 1977, 3 years later, the New York Times had a full-page article on the specific intent of the CIA to alter personalities, and that Vacaville was one of the places they were doing it. I wrote in 1974 that over the past year I have accumulated evidence of mind-altering methods and how they pertain to the past political assassinations. The United States has financed psychosurgical experiments in Boston by doctors Mark, Irvin, and Dr. Sweet, and now they are spreading around the country and also overseas in places such as South Korea. Plans exist, this was in 1974, to turn large masses of population into zombies to be used for future slave labor and also for kamikaze war troops. The prisoners became the experimental scapegoats. Dr. Jose Delgado, funded by NASA and Navy intelligence, came to the United States in 1950, and he had lived under Franco Spain's administration and helped with brain surgery and began experimenting with electrode implants to order persons to act against their own will. Dr. Delgado had perfected these electrodes quite a few years ago and was given at least $1 million by the Justice Department, Health, Education, and Welfare, Navy intelligence, and NASA. And when you think of some of Sam, you have to go back to the quotation which I had in my article, which was from the congressional records of February 1974 of Dr. Delgado. And this goes back to the motives of why they tested Sam. Right now, David Berkowitz is watching the Flintstones, watching television, very happy, laughing, eating his 3 meals a day, sleeping at night like a baby, enjoying himself, not aware of any of the trauma he's been into, and yet saying that he is under the control of these people, various people, and names them. And this motive for testing people like the Son of Sam was stated in the congressional record. This is what Dr. Delgado said, and I think it's worth repeating every few months on the air so that you understand the motive behind this. He said, "We need a program of psychosurgery for the political control of our society. The purpose is the physical control of the mind. Everyone who deviates from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. The individual may think that the most important reality is his own existence, but that is only his personal point of view that lacks historical perspective. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain so that someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain. That's Dr. Delgado, who came here from Spain and has been working on these techniques and heavily funded by the federal government. I also mentioned in the article that the van that was purchased, a fictitious name for the SLA when they went from San Francisco to Los Angeles for the shootout, was under the name of Ricky Delgado, and wondered if it was dedicated to the man who wanted to destroy minds, and then eventually, a few weeks later, they destroyed their flesh. Well, there was a man who lived one floor below David Berkowitz in New York City by the name of Craig Glassman. He belongs to the Westchester County Sheriff's Deputy Department. He lived on the 6th floor, same window right down below, and this is the note that was pinned to his door, slipped under the door by David Berkowitz shortly before he was arrested. He said, "Craig, you will be punished. How dare you force me into the night to do your bidding? True, I am the killer, but Craig, the killings are your commands. The streets have been filled with blood, Mr. Glassman, at your request." They asked David Berkowitz why he targeted Mr. Glassman for these messages, and he said that he was under the control of this man. They asked Mr. Glassman, the sheriff, why Mr. David, the son of Sam, believed that he was manipulating him, and his reason was, "I just happened to move in beneath him. He probably saw me in my uniform." Now here is a sheriff from the New York area, from Westchester, the county right next to where the killings took place. And David Berkowitz is one of the most notorious criminals in the New York City that had 9 million people terrorized for one entire year. So it's hardly likely that he'd be sending letters to a sheriff. He would be very silent, or maybe he'd change his apartment if a law enforcement man moved in right under him and he knew he was a sheriff. It seems that he would change his location, because if a murder took place and they saw him coming in late at night, they would know that he wouldn't have a cover for being in that night. The logic that the sheriff there got letters because this killer saw him doesn't make sense. Craig also sent letters to the Yonkers Police Department telling about his killings and bragging about his killings and scaring them. And it's at the Yonkers Police Department where Mr. Sam Carr's daughter was a full-time dispatcher. Sam Carr is the man that lived downstairs in a house next to the apartment, 7 floors below, who had the dog that the son of Sam said was bothering him and that he had shot. And by calling attention to himself to a man whose daughter is the full-time dispatcher for the Yonkers Police, where all information would come in about son of Sam, or to antagonize or burn the door of the man below him, doesn't make any sense at all. The police department was around him everywhere, and he was in direct contact or antagonizing these families, and nobody had fingered him. The motive for these processes, the kinds of terrors that are taking place in this country, number one, are to spread terror, and it keeps people off guard. Number two, it's good for election years. Mayor Beam in New York is literally beaming. There's an article about how the capture of son of Sam helped him. He jumped right in and gave accolades to the police, even though many murders had taken place and people had been blinded and permanently crippled by this. Mayor Beam came in a year later and was proud of his men. It also tests kamikaze troops. That's the stated purpose of the CIA for some of their experiments, to get people who are willing to die. The Chowchilla defendant Frederick Woods had said, "If you arrest me, I'm going to die," and David Berkowitz said, "I'm going to die." They haven't killed themselves, but they are testing these people to do murders and take chances because they can be used as future armies. There also were a lot of anti-Semitic reasons for using David Berkowitz, and it was done for the same reasons that Jack Ruby was used to kill Harvey Oswald, or Bernard Weissman was used to put his name on the ad the day that John Kennedy was killed. And we'll go into that more, the political overtones of that. But every July, TV gets pretty dull. The summers are an exciting time for crime in America. The mass media plays it up, and I believe it's synchronized. And if you don't believe it, mark your calendar for next July and August 1978 and wait for the next media events. We're running out of motion pictures such as Jaws and The Towering Inferno and Roller Coaster, Airport, The Exorcist, and Earthquake. Now you have TV movies on the John Kennedy assassination coming up by Lawrence Schiller, on the Martin Luther King assassination, the Chowchilla story, the Gary Gilmore story, the Son of Sam movie. We've had the Boston Strangler, In Cold Blood. The SLA sequels are coming up on TV. The movie The Manson Family got a lot of play. And yet every single one of these media events is unsolved as of today and could be solved. The Los Angeles Times an article yesterday, August the 21st. It says the Sam Circus ending its long run on the streets of New York. The man, they say, the son of Sam, watches reruns of the Flintstones, but he had a lot more interest. It says this circus went on. It sold millions of newspapers. It occupied hours of airtime during the dog days of summer, when much of the city normally operates at half speed, and it goes into the thousands and thousands of dollars of contracts and money made. Headline articles, How I Became a Mass Killer by David Berkowitz, offering $500 for a certain letter, $15,000 for other Army documents of David Berkowitz, and hundreds of thousands of dollars for tapes made immediately after he was arrested by a man who has still not explained how he got into the jail. And this has become a big business. It's important to know that. Also, the police department was very careful, even though the Yonkers Police Department was in on the story and could have made the arrest. The Los Angeles Times goes into the fact that the New York Police Department announced 25 promotions for the officers who worked on the Son of Sam case. The Deputy Inspector Dowd was promoted 2 grades to Deputy Chief. His top assistant, Captain Joseph Borelli, was promoted to Deputy Inspector. Joe Strana was promoted from Detective 3rd grade to Detective 2nd grade. Edward Ziga went from 2nd grade to the 1st grade. The two police officers who wrote the ticket for David Berkowitz were promoted to Detective 3rd grade. And the Yonkers police officers who actually broke the case and had the information were invited to the promotion ceremonies. They received a commendation certificate from Mayor Beam. They were very bitter, they said, because they were the ones who made the break in the story. And the Los Angeles Times goes on to say that the New York Police Department wouldn't possibly let the Yonkers cops win or take credit for the case. They said the 2 Yonkers cops who worked in the case, who passed the information on to the Berkowitz to the New York Police Intelligence, were not notified even of the impending arrest. The New York police had worked in this case, and they wanted to bring in the most notorious criminal, and they didn't want to take a chance allowing a modest suburban police department to share the big place of the limelight. It was worse than that. They didn't want to take a chance that somebody else would bring in the Son of Sam, but they wanted to make sure that all these promotions were in line, and the whole team, many of them, were promoted. I said last week on Dialogue Conspiracy that it was time for the police to close in on this case. They could have done it, I said June, the family has evidence in April, but they couldn't wait for that big massacre, that big last-minute brahu that he was going to do at the discotheque, because evidently the links of the Son of Sam to police negligence would be just too overwhelming. Again, the links to the Manson family, the military, if exposed, would cause a lot of consternation. It had to be the Sheriff Peter Pitchess who picked them up, released them even after Sharon Tate had been killed, and sent them out to the Barker Ranch, away from the Spahn Ranch. The police have a way of ending the capture if the time is due, just like they had a way to bring in Patty Hearst. When other law enforcement agencies or other persons get in on the case, then the large police department who's behind it in the first place has to bring in the suspect, because the capture is as dramatic and as important to the police psychology as the crimes themselves. The big story was that the traffic ticket in front of the fire hydrant broke the case, but there were other reasons to believe that the case would be broken. And one reason they couldn't allow the Yonkers police or private individuals to bring it in was that the Mafia were going in for the son of Sam, just like the Mafia under Mickey Cohn were going in to find Patty Hearst. The New York Post said that a powerful Mafia chief, Carmine Galante, said that his people within organized crime would find the killer, that he was outraged by the death of Stacy Moskowitz, and he would send in the Mafia. And when the Mafia finds the killers and the police don't find the killers, that's not very good for the New York Police Department, nor would they get their large promotions. Private vigilantes were being formed in New York to take care of the matter because the police had been negligent, and now the documentation proves that they were negligent. And just like J.J. Arms, a private detective, said that he could find Patty Hearst for $100,000 and was getting ready to find her within 3 weeks, and Mickey Cohn of the Mafia was to find her. Then Charlie Bates of the FBI had to make the grand sweep and bring her in, even though he stood on national television the day that Patty Hearst was found and said that he didn't know how they located her. And I believe that they knew all along where she was, and the hoax was over. The whole SLA story terminated, or part of it terminated, when Patty Hearst was brought in on that day, because they couldn't allow her to get in the hands of some small jail where she wouldn't be tapped or bugged, where her messages wouldn't be taken and published and sold, and they had to be sure that they had the place to put her in and the proper people to set the propaganda mill going a little further about Patty Hearst and what she had to say to her friends. The actual capture of Son of Sam, or the story of Son of Sam, hinges upon 5 different sources of information, which will not be put in the Meredith book, the publishers, that's coming out. The first is Mrs. Cecilia Davis. She was an Austrian-born woman who got citizenship in 1957 in the United States, who lived 1 block from where Stacy Moskowitz was killed. She's the woman who looked eye to eye to David Berkowitz the night of the killing and saw him carrying a package, and claims that she didn't tell the police or anybody for days. And she is the one who said she saw the cop put a ticket on the car. The real role about Mrs. Cecilia Davis and how she came to this country, or what she does, is very important to the capture story. The next important subject is Craig Glassman, the sheriff that lived below David Berkowitz. And the third one is Sam Carr, the gentleman who had the American flag flying 7 stories below David Berkowitz, who had the dog. And Sam Carr's daughter, as I said, was a dispatcher at the Yonkers Police Department. It would be interesting to know the relationship of Sam Carr to the person who rented a room up in New Rochelle to David Berkowitz before he moved to Yonkers. These people corresponded with each other. They got to know each other. They had informed the police department about the situation, and their relationship to this particular victim is as important as the relationship of Lee Harvey Oswald to the rooming house where he stayed at Earlene Roberts, or his rented rooms at the YMCA, and his locations at the home of Ruth Payne in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The housing of these agents is important to the story. Also, the Army friend of David Berkowitz in Houston, Texas, that supplied the gun for the fatal shootings, he went all the way to Texas, met an Army buddy who gave him the guns, and he said then he came home until 1 month later when he received his orders to kill. Also, the psychiatric records from the Army would tell the whole story. When he wasn't court-martialed, then what did they decide to do with him? And under the Freedom of Information of the Decency Act, the Army says we won't release profiles or stories of these defendants' Army records or psychological reports. Yet, instead of giving the exact reports of this person, they don't show any shame or embarrassment to make psychological profiles that have no basis in fact, or have photographs of the room with evidence that could be as planted as Arthur Bremer's apartment with Bob Dylan records on the floor and dirty writings on the wall like the SLA left their apartment in San Francisco, and pornographic literature, Arthur Bremer's apartment again, and tried to smear the left, and not that the left uses the pornography, but the Dylan records left there is like the Angela Davis books left at the apartment of Arthur Bremer, and of course the notorious diaries in all these cases. But the real story of Son of Sam will come in the background of Mrs. Cecilia Davis, Craig Glassman, Sam Carr, the friend from Houston who supplied the gun, and the actual Army records. But instead of that, we get this barrage of propaganda that comes out over the media, newspapers, and will be in movies and books for a long, long time to come. Mr. Berkowitz, as I say, rented a room in New Rochelle. He moved out of it after 2.5 months, and he complained about a dog at the house. He went on to be an auxiliary policeman with the New York Police Department, then worked for the federal government in the Post Office Department. He lived one story above Craig Glassman, who was an auxiliary deputy sheriff, and he passed daily or had contact with Sam, who he said was also programming him, whose daughter was the full-time police dispatcher for any information coming over about Son of Sam to the Yonkers Police Department. For a man who was doing these killings and who was so notorious in hiding himself from everybody, he was sending letters that were in the hands of police agents and police persons, and sending his handwriting to Mr. Breslin, the newspaper man on the sheriff's department, neighbors, an old landlady who had the room, this one house, Jana and Jack Cassara, writing them crazy, threatening letters, and writing Sam Carr letters, all of them identifying them with this crazy killer, and yet he's in the midst and in the arms of police and government agents all around. It's interesting, at the time he was captured, after leaving all these letters around, and I mentioned this last week, that when the time to bring him in is due, and the New York police are going to make this great entry and get all their promotions, all they had to do was to go to his car, which is parked downstairs, and he's 7 floors upstairs, and find a .45 caliber submachine gun and a 4-page letter that positively identifies him to all the other killings, which he easily could have taken with him. And then he walks out of the apartment carrying his .44 caliber pistol, and the case, for all purposes, then is supposed to be closed. It's very strange, all the letters he was writing and all the people linked to the police departments. As I say, the most obvious case of mind control that I've seen so far is the story of this David Berkowitz. Donald DeFries was a victim of this. Joseph Romero of the SLA, who went to Vietnam and came home and had the same kind of a treatment, was a victim of the LSD government mind control program. And also, I've referred to a book called The Smith Conspiracy, which is an interesting book. I don't have the name of the author. I couldn't find it on my shelf today. It must be moved around, but you can look it up in a bookstore or library. It's called The Smith Conspiracy. It's about a man who was in Vietnam and objected to the anti-war protesters at home and the people that didn't go along with the war. And they showed him pictures of these protesters. They also had him experience several of his friends blown up in the war movement. So this person was taken into a mind experiment program, and he came home and was married, and his wife knew that his personality was changing, and he was under hypnosis. And she went to his doctor, but the doctor also worked for the CIA, for the government, and the point was that they were going to kill a black leader at Hunter's Point and shoot him, and they were programming this man for kamikaze killing. But the way they tested him was to take him to an animal shelter and take out a dog and kill the dog and test him on killing the dog. And in this case, David Berkowitz was at the animal shelter at New Rochelle or Westchester County with another person. He was in the company of another person. He wasn't alone. He complained of a dog in a room that he rented from this one party. He shot the dog of Sam Carr down below, and dogs figured in part of the mind control, triggered something off in the program for his mind. Now, there were things that he said besides the fact that he charged Craig Glassman with sending him out on the streets to kill. As soon as he was arrested, you've seen these quotations, "I was out to kill, it was my job. Sam told me to do it. Sam sent me on the assignments. I had to do what I had to do. I had to take orders. I got orders through Sam Carr's dog," which sounds a little ridiculous, until you believe or can understand that there is a possibility that with electrode implants he could hear the dog bark and it could trigger him off. Because Sam Carr lived 7 floors below in a house around the corner, and David Berkowitz was on the 7th floor, there wouldn't be any reason for a man in Yonkers living up in a building on the 7th floor to even worry about a neighbor's dog. He couldn't even see that dog, and he wouldn't even have to pass it. When he went to work at the post office, all he had to do was to go around another corner, and he wouldn't know Sam Carr had a dog unless He was electronically controlled with an electrode implant, and the dog barked because there was no reason in the world for David Berkowitz to even see the dog. If he were in an apartment building with him, it would be different. But the same man whose daughter was the police dispatcher at Yonkers, where all of this was taking place, lived 7 floors down in a house around the corner, so he couldn't even hear that dog from his apartment or even know the man had a dog or no reason to shoot that dog unless he had the electrode implant so that he was told to do it, such as Lawrence Kwong in San Francisco, who went to a detective 20 times and said, I kept hearing KGO, and he had been in hospitals and had the entire profile of somebody with electrode implants, and then finally went to the window and made an attempt to kill Jim Dunbar, then went around and killed Ben Munson, went around the front of the building. And he kept hearing KGO, and there'd be no reason for Lawrence Kwong to hear anything any more than David Berkowitz, except that Sam Carr's dog could have had the sounds upstairs on the 7th floor. He said that he's commanded by this party who lives way downstairs. He said, I didn't want to kill men. I wanted to kill women. He was out to kill them. And he said he would drive around until he got a sign or instructions of when to kill. And when he got the sign and everything was right, he says, I was told what to do. They told me to kill. When I got the sign, then I would kill. Do you show remorse for killing 7 innocent people? No. Why should I? He said, I was commanded. And that is consistent with getting orders. As I say, Joseph Romero of SLA was in Vietnam. He was a member of the 101st Airborne Division. He signed up for duty twice and came home. He was originally a pacifist and then became a killer and killed Dr. Marcus Foster, the head of the Oakland School, the superintendent of the Oakland School Board. The white man lived who was shot, and Dr. Foster was killed. Joseph Romero said he began to take a lot of drugs. He couldn't get out of his house without completely being drugged out of his head. Joseph Romero is now at San Quentin Prison working with the White Aryan Brotherhood, consistent with the Nazi threats that they would kill this school leader, Dr. Marcus Foster. The mystery of these murders is never solved. The problem is always open. The motives are unclear. The New York Daily News, the New York Times, Washington Post say the problem is solved, but the questions still remain. The questions will still remain until we go into the Army programs. David Berkowitz enlisted in the Army, and by 1974 he had a total personality change. He said, I went through a vast transformation. It had to do with acid and the LSD test. He also wrote letters saying, I want to be a conscientious objector. I don't want to be in the Army. He wrote a letter saying that he was renouncing his religion of being a Jew. He was going to become a Baptist. But he wrote letters, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. He said, drugs and a decision not to carry a gun in the Army turned an unnoticed youth to a militant dove. The only thing on my mind, he said, is drugs and music and pollution and poverty and peace and love. I can't wait till tomorrow. He said, I want to escape this lousy life. And he had an obsession while in Korea against war and gun. He objected to being taught to fight. He said, they taught me to fight. They taught me weapons, demolition, riot control, and self-defense when he actually went over as a typist. And he sent letters on how he hated the Army, and he thought he was going to be court-martialed. And he had an aversion to the entire war system, but instead of court-martialing him, they didn't do that to him. They sent him to the psychological area, the Army psychiatrist, and did a job on them. There's one letter that he wrote about his love for people, how he loved people, and he said, I want to get out of this. I want to make love to the world. I love people. I don't belong to the earth. And he said that he got orders to kill, and he didn't want to because he said, I love people. And that goes to what happened out here at Fort Ord in, as I say, in 1972. We're talking about David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who was in South Korea 1972 to 73. And I want to tell you about this particular person who was in the Army. His name was Kenneth Armstrong. And on May the 9th, 1972, he was teaching individual tactical training. This is from an Army report from the Pentagon out at Fort Ord. And he was teaching how to murder and kill when President Nixon escalated the Asian War. He put down his pencil and his instructions and said, do you know what happened last night? President Nixon's decision to blockade North Vietnam was wrong. That's why we're having rioting in this country, in Berkeley, in Colorado, the Bank of America, Pacific Grove. I'm not going to give this class today because I don't believe in killing. If I'm sent back to Vietnam, I won't go. If I go, I won't fight. I will never take a life, even in self-defense. He said the Associated Press, the United Press are controlled by the government. They put out only news that the government wants put out. They don't put out correct information. The Army is supposed to be the best informed in the world, but it's not true. He said, I listen to Earth News and Zodiac News, and there's a woman, he referred to Mae Brussell, a radio personality who has a program at 4 o'clock on Saturdays. We used to be on Saturdays. I met and spoke with her, and she talks about the Kennedy assassinations and about opening the archives and about Lee Harvey Oswald being an agent. And he went on to say that he didn't want to serve the Army anymore. Fort Ord wrote up a report. He no longer enjoys his work in the service. He feels isolated, and the reason he's compelled to beat his wife, they began beating his wife, which was an untrue story, is that he's disturbed, misinformed, easily led, and basically a passive person. He conversed with me, this is the Army officer, that the government is corrupt because it does not represent the people. The people do not want war. President Nixon is making the war, and the war continues and is morally wrong. Sergeant Armstrong does not have a security clearance, but he has been banned now from further instruction of trainees at Fort Ord, and I recommend psychiatric counseling to assist with his living in peace with himself and the world as he perceives it. It is affecting his job and his family. He was married and had 2 little children, and his emotional security. If he cannot resolve his inner conflicts, I recommend whatever action is deemed appropriate to assure the Army an honest day's work commensurate to the rank he occupies and the pay he's receiving. Signed, Don Markham, Major Infantry, Chief Combat Division. And they ordered him for psychological mental hygiene consultation at Fort Ord, and they were going to ship him out of the state, and they said, let's go into his early home life, his feelings, his relationships with his wife, and the most admired male in his early life, and find out who he liked. Well, I advised Mr. Armstrong that I would represent him in the court-martial and bring the facts to the case, so they dropped the court-martial, just like David Berkowitz was going to be court-martialed in South Korea. They then wanted to send him out of the state, and they called him to the psychiatrist. I gave him my tape cassette and told him to take down everything he says to the Army psychiatrist, because they'll write a profile on him like they did on Lee Harvey Oswald or David Berkowitz to make him look crazy because he objected to this insane war that was going on in Southeast Asia. He took the tape cassette there, and the officers at Fort Ord, the mental health, said, don't you trust me? Are you paranoid? He said, don't put it down in the records. I'm paranoid. He said, I don't know you, and you don't know me, and I want to make sure that what you write is what I said. And I have tape collection in my tape collection. I have the recordings that he took with the Army psychologist, and they said, well, you can leave, come back next week. And they put him in a room where the tape recorder couldn't be attached, where there was no electricity. They put him out in a shed where there was no electricity, and then wouldn't let him record the conversation with the Army psychiatrist, and wanted to send him, I think it's South Carolina. I have the name of the state and further papers at home in my files. They wanted to send him for special psychological training out of the state. And we objected, and I came to his assistant at the time and said that they would do a mind control job on them. And this was in 1972, and I'd been on Dialogue Conspiracy a year. I started in May of 1971, and I had built up an audience at Fort Ord of people that, this is 1977, that was 5 years ago, that were aware of these mind jobs that were happening. If I knew David Berkowitz, if he were out here at Fort Ord, maybe we could have prevented those 6 murders in New York and that slaughter of this programmed zombie. I've been studying this a long time, and that's why I wanted to do a 2-part show on Son of Sam, because I understand what the Army was doing. I was right in the middle of it, just like I objected and strenuously put up a battle to save the mind of Robert Hyde at Vacaville when he was going to go psychosurgery because he knew too much about the John Kennedy assassination and the Robert Kennedy assassination. And this was one of my prouder moments in terms of being practical in terms of the research. A lot of people say, why are you doing this work? What is the purpose? What are your goals? And some of these individual relationships I've had with men in prison or the men in the Army, where I've tangled the powers that be, such as the Presidio trial out at Fort Ord at the time the men were charged with treason. I got into that and was calling the White House and the Navy Department and active in that. The research can be used in a practical way where you do touch people's lives, and I was able to help this person. And what happened was they gave an honorable discharge and got him out of the Army and didn't send him away for a mind control job. And I sent a letter to Major Markham. I have a copy here. It's a six-page letter in which I stated some of these facts. I said, Major Don Markham recommends that Kenneth Armstrong be given psychiatric counseling to assist him in living with peace and himself and the world as he perceives it. Kenneth Armstrong is going to a psychiatrist only as part of a routine severance as a conscientious objector. Nothing about his childhood or his parents or family or sex life or dreams or fantasies is any of your business except the nightmare that he has about the killings in Vietnam. Those were placed upon him by serving in the military and would be eliminated when his uniform is taken off. If the military is affecting his job and his family and his emotional security, I suggest that you release him from the Army. This recommendation that you take whatever action is appropriate to ensure he gives the Army an honest day's work appears to be a threat and a lack of total regard for complaints listed by Kenneth Armstrong and against his being in the service as a human being. This sounds like a master-slave order and not an intellectual analysis of a person's needs or attitudes. Sincerely, Mae Brussell. That was the conclusion of a 5-page letter to Major Markham at Fort Ord, and then this particular person was released from the military, and this has been going on for a long time. The son of Sam is Uncle Sam's baby, and there's a lot more like them, and the streets will be filled with terror and violence and killing unless we really try to solve these problems. Well, I think that's enough. Next week we'll probably conclude a little bit on Son of Sam and then go into the death of Elvis Presley and other news that's pertinent of the week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's Dialogue Conspiracy, and I'll see you next week. Hope all is well. See you next week.
There is a truth, I thought to myself, while driving down Route 68, the car in front is a Renault. It's not behind, it's not a Ford. There is a truth, how things happen. If it was yesterday, it wasn't 1894. And if tomorrow not to come true, there'll be another truth in store. And those who think there is no truth, it all depends on point of view. Will lock us up, fire the bomb made only for a gentleman to use. President is just a choice. He should not incite or claim his fame. One November night, I heard the screaming horns. A new America had changed her name. We're not the same. You and I are not. You who call free thinkers enemies, you are clearly now the enemies. And we will do what we must do to keep it free, like I was right. And she must sing, and they must slave. You must have heard that we will never really rise again. The mind behind the plastic mules gave the word. They cannot just mow us down. It's they who are the arch anemic ones. Ours are free and tender girls. Ours are mountain climbing sons. So you and I who disagree, truth exists but misery. I cry for you, I cry for us, as I prepare to leave the bus.